When did you first start to write?
I started to write when I was a little girl. When I was a little girl, I'd say as early as 8 years old, I started to scribble stories. Reading was I was preoccupied with reading. I was considered the best reader in my school. I went to school, an elementary school of about 200 people, and I was considered the best reader in the school. And so I was always reading books, and I'd say about 8 years old, I started to scribble stories down. And I continued to do that. I continued to do that when I was an adolescent, and when I was in high school. About the 10th grade, one summer, I wrote my first story on notebook paper and sent it to 17 magazine.
Where did you go to school? In Cleveland? In Ohio?
I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, went to the Cleveland Public Schools. But the Cleveland Public Schools aren't like the Cleveland Public Schools in Cleveland are today. The Cleveland Public Schools in the 1930s and 40s were really considered models of good schooling. And so you got a very good public school education. Of course, and then I went to Ohio State. But I was always, I've always been interested in literature. I've always been interested in those stories, whether it was, and I wrote a lot about that in People Who Led to My Plays. In adolescence, some of my, favorite books were of course, maybe my favorite book in adolescence is still the Brontes, Jane Eyre, and Wuthering Heights.
Can you tell me about your experience going to Ohio State and what you majored in?
Well, all my mother's friends were elementary school teachers. They were women, they were black American women who'd gone to school in the South. And when they were black American women who'd gone to school in the South. And they were all school teachers. So I was expected, as my friends were expected, I was expected to be a school teacher. And so when I enrolled at Ohio State, I majored in elementary education. But after I took a few education courses, I found them very boring. So I went over, I thought maybe I'd major in sociology, but I decided against that. So then I went over to the English department, because I was taking an English course where we read Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Faulkner, and I was so, reading those people made me so happy. So I went over to see if I could maybe try to find out about how to major in English. But I didn't know that Ohio State didn't accept blacks into the English department. And they didn't accept blacks into the English department for maybe like another 15 years. So I was given the runaround, and so I ended up majoring in education, and I was very unhappy with it.
And what did you do after you graduated from Ohio State?
Well, Joe and I got married. We got married. Joe was he was in the Army. By that time, Joe went to Columbia. We met at Ohio State, and then he went to Columbia grad school, and then he was drafted. And we got married, when I graduated from Ohio State. And he was in Korea for a year, and then we went to New York. And that's January 1955. We went to New York because he was in grad school at Columbia.
And your first time in New York, were there any breakthroughs with your writing, with your writing career?
Well, the mid-50s, I think everyone knows that. The mid-50s It was a very exciting time to be in New York City, and certainly to be up at Columbia University. So I had a small baby, you know, your Uncle Joe, but I was very lucky. I went to the New School of Social Research, I went to the American Theater Wing, and I spent 2 years writing a novel in the Columbia University's extension program. And of course, this is my first introduction to people who were professional writers. In all of those courses, there was always someone who was a professional writer. And I seemed to kind of measure up to these people. I was only 22 or 23, but I seemed to measure up to these people. And when I went to the New School, which is very famous, my instructor said that I wrote the second best play in the class, and it was called The Pale Blue Flowers, and it's now in my archives at the University of Texas. And she said she entered it into a contest, and that was a big deal. I was about 23, and so she entered it into a contest. And then when I studied, I wrote this novel. I was in Columbia, called the Columbia, the Extension Program, and my professor said I was touched with genius. So these people were very important to me. His name was John Selby, and my teacher at the New School, his name was Mildred Cooner, and these people were terribly important. And so I gained confidence because I was still battling this idea that I was a housewife with a baby.
When did you get your first play gets published or performed?
Well, that was a long time afterwards, because when I was in John Selby's class and in Mildred Cooner's class, that was like 57, 58, something like that, 56, 57, 58, and I didn't get my first play actually performed professionally for quite a long time, and that was 1964. I spent a lot of time writing, even though I had a small child. I spent a lot of time writing. In the meantime, that's when we went to Africa, and that's when my work, as I've told you so many times, changed drastically, because I'd never been to Africa and I'd never been to Europe, and we were gone exactly a year, and that's when all the imagery, all the themes of my work came together. And that's when I wrote, when I was in Africa and Italy that year, 1960, that's when I wrote Funny House of a Negro, and much to my dismay, a lot of people still feel that's the best thing I've ever written. And of course that doesn't make me feel very good, because that was such a long time ago. But in any case, that was a turning point, and I came back to New York. Joe was working for AMSAC, and we had a baby, of course. Now we had another baby, Adam, who was born in Rome.
Could you list the countries, say the countries that you visited on your trip?
On my trip? Well, first of all, one of the most exciting things was we went on the Queen Mary, and I've shown you the movie when we were on the Queen Mary. We went on the Queen Mary from, of course, New York City, the harbor, to Southampton, England, and then we took the train. It's as clear to me as if it were yesterday. Took the train from Southampton into London, and we were in London, and Joe planned it, so we spent 5 days in each city until we got to West Africa. So we spent 5 days in London, 5 days in Paris, 5 days in Madrid, 5 days in Casablanca, and And then we arrived in North Africa, a place called, well, it's not really North Africa, Abidjan. And then our destination was Liberia. Well, this totally changed me. I'd never seen those places. I'd never seen all these historic places, Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, in France, the Tuileries, the Versailles. I'd never seen those places. So all those places started to appear in my work, and they still have to this very day. Because I have this theory that, the first time you see something, it's really quite monumental in your mind. It's monumental. The first time you see the Tower of London, first time you see the Thames, all these places that I've been reading about all my life. First time you're on an ocean liner and you're crossing the Atlantic. So my work changed very much, as I said before. When I came back, I had this play, Funny House of a Negro, and I had part of another play called The Owl Answers. And there's no doubt that my work was much stronger than it ever had been.
Would you say that was unusual for a black family to be traveling all across Europe and Africa?
Joe was a part. This is where Joe was a part of like a second wave of American blacks who went to West Africa. There had been perhaps some other scholars who came before him, Du Bois, a man called Sinclair Drake. There had been a group of American blacks who were trying to live in Ghana. They were trying to live in Liberia. And so they came first, but we certainly were unusual because Joe's kind of on the second rung. And when we were on the Queen Mary, we were the only black American couple. That's all I can tell you, And when you didn't see many American blacks in any of those cities at the time. So when we were in London, there weren't many. Very often there were entertainers. There were entertainers. I can't think of who they are now, but I think. Well, no, that was like 1960. And then, of course, in Paris, there were a lot of entertainers, but we still stood out quite a bit. We still stood out quite a bit because we weren't entertainers. We were just this family. So it was very unusual, and I only knew one other couple a woman I grew up with in Cleveland who lived in Liberia. She and her husband lived in Liberia, but we certainly stood out, and it's not like today where many American blacks go to Africa.
Could you name some of your most famous, influential plays?
Well, I go back to Funny House, where the heroine Sarah has several different personalities. And The Owl Answers is also a play done by the famous, now deceased, Joe Papp at the Public Theater, where, again, the heroine has many personalities, and these are historical characters. And so I would say The Owl Answers, Funny House. I had a play called Rat's Mass that a lot of people liked very much. It has a religious theme in it. And it was done at a very famous theater called Café La Mama. And then, of course, when I was in Africa, I wrote a story called Because of the King of France. And that story ended up in a very prestigious journal called Black Orpheus. And it's about a little boy who has his identity is all mixed up. And that was a theme that is very persistent in my work. Later on, I wrote a play once that a lot of people liked called An Evening with Dad Essex. It was about this black American sailor, who shot a lot of people, and it was a big story. It was a big story, maybe like in the early 70s. And then a lot of people who like my work like the play I wrote about Ohio State murders. And then, of course, Adam and I did a brief interview about my encounter with the Beatles, and we also did a play on his encounter with the Arlington Police Department called Sleep Deprivation. My plays are definitely liked by academics, and that has sustained them. That's what's made them, given them life. They've never reached a broad public, never. But academics have been teaching my plays now, I would say since the 1973 or 4, something like that. There's always someone somewhere who's teaching one of my plays in the academic world, and those are the people who've kept my career afloat. And those were the people who because they were teaching my plays, I got teaching jobs, because it sort of went hand in glove, and that's why I got published.
Could you tell me in brief about being in London and work on Mom, How'd You Meet the Beatles, and meeting the various celebrities?
Is this the last question?
Yeah.
All right, I'll try.
In brief.
We have a book. Adam wanted to know this, although he was with me the entire time, called Mom, How'd You Meet the Beatles? Of course, it's a terribly long story, but the fall of 1966, I was in the middle of getting a divorce from Joe, and I was extremely unhappy, and it appeared that I was going to get a grant. Everyone said I was going to get this grant called the Guggenheim. It's a very prestigious grant, and they give you money to write for a year. And then it appeared I was also going to get a couple of Rockefeller grants, which I did. I got all these grants. So I had the money to go to London. London was very cheap in 1966. And we lived in a gorgeous, beautiful place called Chalcott Crescent. And I had a friend who, Jody used to always read these little books that John Lennon had written. One was called In His Own Right, one was called A Spaniard in the Works. And Jody was crazy about the Beatles. He was just crazy about them. And Adam was also, even though Adam was he wasn't even 5 years old yet, he also was crazy about the Beatles. So I was trying to figure out what I could do. So Jody was always reading these little books. I said, well, maybe I can make a play out of that and go to London. And by some strange thing, this man at the place called Circle in the Square in New York, he said, Adrienne, would you like to write a play for us? Would you like to do that? Of course, they pay you to write a play, and you have a certain time limit. So I said, sure, I'd like to write about the Beatles. I'd like to make a play out of John Lennon's nonsense book. He said, well, by the way, he said, I know John Lennon's publisher. That was odd. So he knew Lennon's publisher, a man called Tom Mashler, who was the head of a very famous publishing house in London. And I decided, in the meantime, to go to London. And so I went to see Tom Mashler, and he said, "That's a great idea, but he said, there's nothing I can do." He said, "I don't have any money to give you," and I certainly, he said, "But when I see John, I will mention this." So he never called. And I saw him at a couple of events because everybody was very social, and he never mentioned it, and I didn't mention it. But as fate would have it, there was a person I was supposed to call when I went to London, and her name was Nan Lanier, and she and her husband started a theater in New York, and she knew my work very, very well. She also we're the same age. We were in the middle of getting divorced, and we had small children. And so I went to see Nan, and I told her, she said, "Well, Adrienne, what are you doing?" I told her I had this material from John Lennon's nonsense books, and people find this hard to believe, as I find it hard to believe. She said, "Well, do you know who Victor Spinetti is?" And she said, he was in the Beatles movies, and he's my dearest friend. And she said, "I'll call him right now. I'll call him up right now, and I think he would love to work on something like this." She did. She actually went to the phone right then and called him up. He was at the theater, and he said, "Tell her to come and see me tomorrow." That's very unlike people in the theater. People in the theater say, "Oh, I'm all tied up, until next fall. Call my secretary." But he didn't say that. He said, "Tell her to come and see me tomorrow." And I went to see him on Leicester Square in London. And he was in The Odd Couple, Neil Simon's really famous play. And he said, "I'd love to work on this. I'm going to go out and see John. John lives out in a place called Weybridge, I think. He lives out there. I'm going to go out and see him, and I'm going to ask him, would he like to work on this?" In about, I don't know, less than a week, he went to see him, and he called up Nan, and he said, tell Adrienne Kennedy, John's very interested in this, and he'd like to meet her. And so, in probably less than a month, we went down to this place off Piccadilly Circus, it was a studio, and John was there, Paul McCartney was there, and John was very excited. They were excited. I was from New York. I was older. I was almost 40. They were like 24, 25, and they were excited. And in the meantime, there's a man I met at a party. He worked with Laurence Olivier. His name was Ken Tynan. And he said, "Well, we'd be interested in that too." It was a miracle. It was just like a miracle. So then, now it seemed like the Beatles were interested in it, and so was the National Theatre, of which Laurence Olivier, the most famous actor in the world, was the head of. So everything seemed to go well, and we did a workshop, and everything seemed to just be perfect. But it ended quite badly, because there came a point, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but there came a point soon after where Victor Spinetti and the people of the National felt that they didn't need me. They didn't need me. Well, why? Why do we need her? We have John Lennon interested, and over a period of a couple of months or so, they just sort of dropped me, and apparently, because I had some good English friends and really some quite prestigious. I went to a very, there's a woman called Helena Bonham Carter. She took me to her lawyer, and he said, "Well, there's nothing she can do because, she was talking to me too. So there's nothing you can do. You're not a member of any British writers group. You have no legal recourse. And so there's a few. So that happens in the theater all the time. But of course I was immensely upset. I spent about a week crying, and they just sort of dropped me from it, and they did it without telling me. And the play opened the spring of 1968, and it was a failure. And people who were my friends like to always say, oh, well, it's a failure because you weren't involved in it anymore. But John Lennon tried to keep me in the project. He really did. He was on his way to India, and he really tried to keep me in the project. But they didn't see any reason, why they wanted him to write it. And, of course, that happens all the time in the theater. It was a big lesson, huge lesson, and I've had other lessons like that. So, but I thought that Lennon, and of course I met Ringo, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, I thought they were immensely nice people. Really, really nice people. Very unpretentious. I couldn't believe it. They were so unpretentious. They're so easy to talk to.
I guess could you just list the universities you worked at?
Well, I had a very lucky academic career. It's almost like the Beatles. I had been in New York, of course, with Adam. Joe and I were separated. Jody was in college. Adam and I had been in New York all these years. But when I came back from London, I couldn't quite get settled. So I was actually on a ferry once, and I met these people, and this woman said to me, I live in New Haven. She said, so wonderful, it's just like a small New York, and there's the drama school there, and, Yale is there, maybe you could try it. She was from New York. I think she even still had her New York apartment. So, things were flowing in those days. So I thought maybe I'll try living in New Haven. I knew many people at the drama school. In fact, I knew the man very well. His name is Bob Brustein, who's the head of the drama school. Went to live in New Haven, and of course, rents were cheaper. It seemed easier. It was a smaller arena. It turned out that it wasn't a good experience for Adam. He didn't like it, but I didn't know that was going to happen. And I was standing by the elevator. We lived in this building right by the Yale School of Drama, and it seemed like it was going to be okay to spend maybe an interlude here. I was standing by the elevator, and this woman, her name was Jane Isay. Jane Isay is the person who sent you her book, and she autographed it for you. I think you remember that.
Yeah.
And Jane Isay said, you have an OB, don't you? And I said, yes. She said, you wrote that play Funny House of a Negro, and Joe Papp has done your plays. I said, yes. She said, well, how would you like to teach a college seminar at Yale? I said, well, what is that? I'd love to do that. She said, well, it's something that I'm the head of. And we hire people who actually do these things. And they teach, I could give you like a 2-year contract, and you could teach some Yale boys how to write plays. She said, but they have to hire you. You have to meet with them, and they have to, because that's the way it works. You have to meet with their approval. I went over to this place called Timothy Dwight. It's a hall at Yale, and had lunch with these boys. I'll never forget. There were these 5 boys. They were about 18 years old, and they were like, they were going to decide whether to hire me, and I hit it off very well with them. And so I taught a college seminar. That was my first teaching job. Taught a college seminar at Yale for 4 semesters. And of course, that was quite an introduction to the academic world. So after that, a lot of people asked me to teach. So I ended up, I went to Berkeley. I was an honored guest at Berkeley. A couple of years, 3 or 4 years later, I was something called a Chancellor's Distinguished Lecturer at Berkeley. I was the first black person that African American Studies had as a Chancellor's Distinguished Lecturer. Jimmy Baldwin had been there the year before. He was a Regents Distinguished Lecturer. And that was it was a bigger deal than being a Chancellor's Distinguished Lecturer. But I was a Regents Distinguished Lecturer at UC Berkeley, and I taught at UC Berkeley off and on for a very long time. And that was, people, starting out at Yale was just such a big plus. And then while I was at Berkeley, Stanford is only like an hour away down. It's a bus ride. 2 or 3 times, 3 times actually, people at Stanford asked me if I'd like to come down and teach a course. And that really took up almost all of the 80s. Took up almost all the 80s. And then, of course, when I came back to New York, that kind of ran out. I taught a couple of courses at Princeton once, taught a couple of courses at NYU. And then there was this man who used to always write me these letters. He was German. His name was Werner Solers. And he used to always write me these letters because he was writing, he wrote these articles about me. And he used to send them to me. And he said, how would you like to come up and give a talk in my class? And I will never, ever forget that. It was in the winter, it was snowing, and I was so excited that I was going to give a talk at Harvard. I was so excited. So I arrived there, it was snowing, and I gave this talk in his class, and it went very well. And so then he said, well, how would you like to come and see, I don't have, I only have a bachelor's degree, so my position is always, I'm a visiting lecturer. He said, how would you like to come and, and teach playwriting and maybe another course? And of course, the same thing I had done at Berkeley. I taught playwriting, and then maybe sometimes I taught American theater, sometimes I taught black playwrights of the world, Wally Suyenka, Derek Walcott, and all those people. And so I taught at Harvard for 6 semesters. And to me, that was like, every time I would step onto that campus, I would get so excited. And even my mother got excited. She never got excited about anything. And so it was exciting. And I'm excited that I ended my teaching career teaching at Harvard. I love Cambridge, and I love the international aspect of Cambridge, and it also made my mother very happy. It actually made her very happy, and she was always a little confused as to what I was doing with my life. How did she happen to have this daughter who turned out to be a playwright?